Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome back to my channel. Here is part 2 of me talking about some of the books I read in, I was about to say May, that is not the month we're in March of this year, in 2021, because I want to give a lot of these books a lot of chance for me to ramble about them, and I was worried that I was maybe cutting some of them off too soon. Next up is Jonny Appleseed by Joshua Whitehead. So this is a book that again kind of kept on getting flagged up, and then I saw it in my on kind of Libby again. Libby has been saving the day in March, and it is all about a young kind of queer two-spirit person in Canada who is Indigenous. So he is kind of one of the, getting really well lit here, but one of the First Nations. He's from a First Nations tribe, the name of which has completely escaped me now. And so essentially it's kind of, at first it's weird actually, because listening to it, it does almost feel a lot more like an autobiography than it is a kind of novel, which is kind of how it's presented. So we kind of learn all about this kind of character going through, and you know, he has sort of various moments of being quite poor, where he does, he kind of either strips or does sort of sexual acts on camera to kind of make money. And so it's a really interesting commentary, not only on kind of how for many First Nations people in Canada, you know, they have not been given the financial support or investment to succeed. And so for many of them, they kind of can sometimes live hand to mouth, or they can kind of struggle financially. And there are lots of problems with sort of drugs and alcohol kind of linked to that, as you sort of see with many working class communities. When support is taken away, you know, people kind of go to perhaps whatever they need to kind of feel good and feel all right and what have you. And so it's really quite tragic and quite sad, but it never feels like, again, that these are characters of pity, which I think is really well managed. And so we sort of see him falling in love with men, and his kind of complicated relationship with a close friend of his that is kind of a relationship and then kind of not, and then this boyfriend he has at one point, and you know, it's really complicated and interwoven. But I think what's just so great about it is there's this relationship with his grandmother all the way through, and it's just done so tenderly and so beautifully, and you just kind of really want to hug them both. It's a really beautiful book. It kind of got flagged up again because I think it won a Canadian prize, or there was a Canadian sort of book thing recently where they were kind of talking about big authors and books that people should check out that spoke a lot about Canadian life, and this was one of them. And so yeah, I thought it was well worth checking out, and I'm really glad I did. I think again the audiobook is read by the author. And I really like that when it happens, because there is something so personal and beautiful about hearing that. So yeah, well worth checking out. The next is a bit of a curveball from all of this, but this is partly because not only in the organisation I work for, but also just sort of various friends and what have you over time, I've spoken a bit about love languages, and people seem to be quite keen on these, and I thought I would listen to what it's all about. And this is The 5 Love Languages by Dr. Gary Chapman, and again read by the author as an audiobook. I don't really know how I feel about this, because I think although I think this is a very oversimplified way of dealing with things, I think ultimately there is something quite nice about kind of being made to think about, you know, how people like to, you know, some people really like to receive gifts, or some people naturally just give gifts but don't necessarily think about spending time with people or whatever. You know, it's that classic kind of American teen drama thing of, you know, that kid who feels like his parents just buy him things but never spends any time with him, and he resents that. All those kinds of things. So I thought it was interesting on that front. But for me, partly as a book, it was a book that felt like it could have been an essay or an article. I don't know if I necessarily needed the whole thing, and there were some bits that I struggled with and found maybe potentially a little bit problematic, in terms of, you know, there's very much a kind of sense of like, oh, if you know, part of your love language is like touch and affection, and your partner wants sex, you should just give that to them. And I'm like, partly it's like consent is also a thing, and a really important thing, so maybe, I don't know. I mean, I don't think that's what he was saying per se, but I think there are ways that it doesn't necessarily explore that, let's say. And so I think, yeah, but I mean, I think overall kind of quite nice. I think I just didn't need the whole thing to be as long. I think I just needed an article about this. But yeah, happy to hear other thoughts on it. Then I read the children's book by A.S. Byatt, which is about 600 pages long, and I thought was quite... it's my first time reading A.S. Byatt. I know loads of people really love her. I did enjoy this book. I think partly, I don't know if I needed 600 pages of it. And I don't know if that's heresy to say that. But I also think, you know, there's a lot of really great and interesting stuff happening in the book. It kind of concerns these sort of young characters kind of starting off in various different times in sort of, I want to say Victorian England, and their kind of trajectories through their lives. And they kind of get all these kind of complicated interweaving lives, and, you know, various changes in time happen that kind of complicate things. So I think there's a lot that's really interesting about it. And, you know, the character, it's written really beautifully. The descriptions are gorgeous. Yeah, so I think, yeah, the only thing for me is occasionally it did feel a bit old world in the way it was kind of written. It was kind of meant to be written kind of in a very Victorian style. And there is something really powerful and incredible about how A.S. Byatt's managed to pull that off. But sometimes also for me, I kind of didn't need that. Let's say, I don't know, maybe I'm being harsh or whatever, but I mean, yeah, I mean, overall, I think it was really good. Was part of the 2009 Booker Prize, which I'll eventually come to, but I thought was good, and I'm glad that now that I've read it, I can give it back to the library, because I've been holding on to it for about 6 months, because of lockdown, because the libraries have been closed. Anyway, next up, it was The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff. So this is, I listened to this as an audiobook. Again, quite long, I think, again, sort of 500, 600 pages. And it's a really fascinating investigation into data sharing and kind of how companies originally, you know, for example, a while back, the idea of personal data was kind of seen as quite sacred, and, you know, things weren't necessarily shared, but now actually, you know, whether through apps like Pokemon Go or through just having a phone in general, so much data about ourselves is shared. And this is a really interesting investigation into what happens to that data, what the motivations are for companies to get that data. I mean, hint, it's money, as you probably guessed. And the kind of various ways that these things are being connected and collected in a way that in the past we would have seen as horrendous, but we kind of let happen quite easily now. And so it's a really powerful investigation into those things that did make me kind of quite terrified. Especially, it's quite interesting listening to it as an audiobook through your phone and sort of just staring at your phone kind of every so often, just thinking like, ah, right, okay. Oh dear. But nonetheless, really interesting, and I enjoyed this quite a lot. I thought it was really well written. Again, it's quite long, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, because there's a lot of research and a lot of interesting stuff that goes on behind the scenes in this. Yeah. And next up, I won't go into this one in too much detail, but it is A Burning by Megha Majumdar. And the reason I won't go into detail is because I did a separate video on this, but a really interesting book all about these kind of three characters sort of circling around kind of an unfair trial case in India after a terrorist attack. So again, just super interesting. And yeah, really powerfully written, really quite tense and gripping. I raced through it quite a lot, quite quickly, and I'm intrigued to see again what this book does this year. I think it's one of those books that, again, many people will probably spend a lot of time reading, and I think that we'll probably pick up maybe some nominations for prizes across the year. But yeah, very interesting and good stuff. Next up, I read Crippled by Frances Ryan, which is a book all about austerity and the demonisation of disabled people. That's the subtitle of the book. So I thought this book was stunning. I mean, heartbreaking and really quite depressing in many ways. But essentially, it details what life has been like for people in the UK who are disabled, and particularly after government cuts. It's really quite harrowing because she goes into a lot of detail about kind of various people's lives who have been massively impacted by the government's decision to, and I say decision because it was a decision. Austerity is a political choice. This is my soapbox moment, but austerity is a political choice, and it was a choice that was made knowing that it would harm people's lives. And even as this book articulates, even when evidence was presented that this was killing people, and or making a lot of people's lives far harder than it needed to be. You know, things like the bedroom tax, things like many other things, you know, kind of around the time. So council cuts. It meant that some disabled people went from having an okay, decent quality of life to, in some cases, either just dying or having, you know, having to choose between heating and food, and many other things. I just thought it was heartbreaking, but vital and really powerfully done. And it's kind of one of those books where if you read it and you don't feel angry, I don't know what to say to you, because it just made me furious the entire time. Just the idea that, you know, successive reports were published saying what you're doing is contravention of human rights. You know, the UN even published a report talking about how the UK was breaking the Human Rights Act. The UK government was breaking the Human Rights Act in how it treated disabled people, and still the cuts carried on. So yeah, again, don't know what to say really, apart from this book made me angry in a really good way, and we should all be furious. And that is my political moment of the day, probably to be followed by many more when I come to the next book, which is Against White Feminism by Rafia Zakaria. And this book is brilliant. So this, I think it comes out in September. Again, it was an advanced copy. And this book is a kind of treatise in some ways, talking about how white feminism, and I'll kind of define it loosely here, it's not necessarily the idea of white people being feminist. It is a kind of an idea unto itself, which is white feminism is kind of a feminism that doesn't necessarily consider the needs of other groups outside of its own. And so, for example, it's a feminism that might fight for gender equality, but at the same time trounce the rights of women of colour, either within the UK or kind of internationally. And this book, you know, gives some really interesting personal examples. So Rafia talks about moving from Pakistan when she was fairly young, I think I want to say sort of late teens, and kind of escaping a marriage sort of through that, but how so many people, you know, kind of the way people spoke to her about it was that they essentially that they needed her as an example to kind of be like, wow, isn't it really tough for women in other parts of the world, in a way that was kind of quite self-serving. So it wasn't about making sure that it wasn't about making sure that women in Pakistan were okay. It was about using that as a stick to kind of say, well, people in Pakistan are really sexist, for example. And she talks quite a few times throughout the book about how often, particularly when it comes to things like international aid, this narrative is really dangerous because it treats the situation as if white people going in know exactly what's right for women in Pakistan, and what it is that they need is good old feminism, but in a very specific style. So it's a kind of, that empowerment can only look one way, and that's presented to women in Pakistan as if, you know, they're really backwards and behind and what have you. I'm probably not doing a great job explaining what it is, but I mean, this book is brilliant. I think she is, it kind of reminded me a lot of Hood Feminism by Mickey Kendall, which talks a lot about the women that white feminism forgot, I think is the subtitle of that book. And both books, I think, are brilliant at kind of making us really examine how often, you know, the kind of idea of often kind of white liberalism and kind of liberalism more generally can sometimes do more harm than good, because it presumes that people need saving, and the way that we save them is to kind of make them like us. Yeah, so it's really well done, I think, to kind of call that out and to really talk about how harmful it is. So there's an example of, for example, of women in, I can't remember exactly where, being given these new electric stoves to help them with, you know, not have to go out and collect various bits of wood. But nobody spoke to those women about why they went out and did that. And partly it was because the stoves they had, as much as, you know, it required a little bit more physical labor, those were things that were easily repairable in their area. When the women went out to get the wood, they would do things all together that felt really, that was a kind of a bonding moment, that was a kind of cultural thing, and all of these things kind of interwoven. But if that wasn't the case, if, you know, for example, when these electric stoves are brought in, if they broke, the women couldn't fix them. There was no one in the local area who could fix them for them, and it kind of just it kind of took away something cultural and took away a thing that people did on a regular basis, and so that was actually really quite harmful. But that was considered progress because it was here's something electric, here's something more like the West. And so this book does a really good job of kind of skewering those ideas and really investigating what is so problematic about all of them. Next up was Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Thurston. For some reason I want to say she's Thiel Nurston. Yeah, there we go. That one. This book is really, really interesting. It is kind of a classic of kind of African-American literature that I just hadn't really come to for a really long time. And again, quite short, but really, really powerful and really interesting. So this book talks a lot, for example, about these characters who are caught in various kind of tricky situations. There's this kind of character, Jonny, at the heart of it, who is kind of caught between quite bad relationships and is basically always in a state where she is kind of in danger, or is kind of, you know, essentially kind of what it is like for her as a black woman in the US, particularly at that time, and kind of how that complicates relationships around her. So things are always far more complicated than they need to be. She has to kind of go on the run a few times, and I'm not doing this book any kind of justice, but please do read it. It's brilliant. At times it can be quite tricky. I found bits of it quite tricky because a lot of it's written in it's kind of written in dialect, and sometimes that can be quite difficult to understand, where it was for me. But at the same time, you know, don't let that put you off, because I think there's so much gold in this book, and it's really interesting and really heartwarming and heartbreaking. Yeah, so really good stuff, you know, with all that kind of stuff aside for me. But who knows, that's part of what makes it so brilliant. So yeah, worth checking out. Next up, kind of reading sort of generally in Booker Prize things again, 1972 shortlist here, was Susan Hill with The Bird of Night. I've got the title there for a second. So this book, oh my god, is just stunning. This book is all about, let me see if I can kind of get this right and sort of try and summarize it, but it is a man who is kind of looking up, so there's a famous poet, and he is being looked after by a man who is kind of his friend and kind of his lover. It's never a sexual relationship, but they've got this very deep relationship. But the poet really struggles with mental health, in particular what appears at times to be kind of bipolar. I mean, at risk of sort of diagnosing him, sort of seems to be sort of somewhat bipolar. But either way, there are manic episodes and depressive episodes that this character faces, and you know, this sort of man who's supporting him, it's kind of told through him, and it's just so beautiful and tender, because you can see how much he cares about this man in his life, and how much he's trying to look after him, and how much he sees him as this genius. You know, he's defending him to everybody around him, saying like, no, this man is an absolute genius. Like, his poetry is game-changing and life-changing, and you know, the world of literature will never be the same after this. But at the same time, when there are kind of these various episodes, things become quite complicated, and this man is just tired. He is really worn out from looking after this man, and it really wears him down. And you know, they have this trip to Italy, and it's kind of everything goes wrong in some ways, and it's just very difficult because he's trying to look after him to the best of his ability, but he is worn out and he is tired, and he's doing it all alone. And I just thought it was so tender and brilliant. I think this is just one of the best books I've read in a very long time. It just really blew me away, just how spare some of the language was, but how tender and poignant, and how cleverly it captures some of those feelings of guilt and remorse, and joy and wonder, and the sense of relief that you get as an audience, as a reader, when things come together, and when the poet is well. All those moments are just so beautiful and tender, and it kind of reminds you of, you know, those kind of complicated relationships where, you know, within family or within sort of romantic relationships, where sometimes it's not easy and it's not smooth, but actually there are these moments of these flashes of moments where things are so clear and brilliant and wonderful, and moments where things are so horrible and dark and difficult. And this book manages those so beautifully. And now I need to go and read more of Susan Hill, who is an author whose name I know, but I've never really gone and read much of. I think she wrote The Woman in Black. That sounds right. So yeah, and she's sort of known for some of her horror as well. And this book doesn't feel like horror. It's much more a kind of really tender, beautiful thing. So yeah, really worth checking out. Next up, as part of the High Bear Nation with Simon Savage, his mum, and Tom Reads Things, was Cheerful Weather for the Wedding by Julia Strachey. I want to say that's how you pronounce her surname, which is, you know, written quite a long time ago. I think it was written in the 30s, and I listened to the audiobook, which is read by Miriam Margolyes, who is hilarious and brilliant. Anyway, and this, whoops, just destroying things. And this book I just thought was so interesting in some ways. It's kind of written as a bit of a farce. You know, so many things are going wrong. There's this wedding that's happening and everything starts to go wrong. People are angry with each other and falling out, and pardon me, it looks like things aren't going to happen and it's all going to get destroyed. And the kind of the joy is the farcical nature of it. You're meant to kind of almost revel in how absurd and how silly so many parts of this are. And I thought it was really well done. Then next was The School of Life with How to Find the Right Words. So The School of Life is kind of primarily sort of, it's been like a YouTube channel. It's kind of a project of Alain de Botton, who is a sort of philosopher. I want to say pop philosopher, and I don't mean that in a way that demeans it, but I think he tries to engage with philosophy in a way that brings it into things that people would talk about a lot more regularly. So things like relationships, work, you know, like work contexts, offices, you know, all those kinds of things, and how we bring in philosophy into those. And this whole very short book is about how we find the right words to deal with certain situations. So breakups, or firing someone, or telling someone you disagree, or setting boundaries, and all those kinds of things. And so I thought it was an interesting book. I think it does these kind of quite well. I think it just maybe misses some of the depth for me. And I also feel like, not to kind of be like, I'm top of the class here, but as someone who has like followed some of their videos for many years, of the School of Life, for me this doesn't feel like a massive departure from those videos. So I kind of, part of me feels like maybe it's more worth just watching the videos. I don't know. I mean, maybe worth checking the videos out to see if this is the kind of thing that interests you. If it does interest you, then maybe check out the book. It's a nice little kind of small gift. What's the word? Like a stocking filler kind of thing. So that's kind of all quite nice. Last two, apologies, this is going on a while. Last two, David Baddiel, the UK comedian and author and writer and various other guises, with Jews Don't Count. So this is his rather short book that's kind of a bit of a treatise again on anti-Semitism, and particularly how often when we talk about racial equality, or when we talk about ethnic minorities, Jewish people are often kind of left out of the conversation. And, you know, I found this quite interesting. Me, myself, as someone who is not Jewish and is white, this is something that, you know, the kind of the double effect. I wasn't sort of sure where I sit in being able to kind of articulate some of these things, because, for example, he talks about how for Jewish people, you know, often anti-Semitism is seen as a lesser racism, if that makes sense. So, for example, the anti-black racism is seen as kind of proper racism, and anti-Semitism is sometimes seen as being kind of a lesser one, where it's kind of not as serious or whatever. So he really digs into what that looks like. And although, you know, potentially I think this book, if fleshed out a bit more, because it's quite short, I think could kind of hit a few other notes. Because I think, for example, as a few people have kind of pointed out, it doesn't really delve into sort of intersectionality, and it doesn't deal with the fact that perhaps, you know, many kind of particularly European Jewish people are read as white, and what that means. So I mean, it does go into that in a little bit of detail, but I mean, it's a very difficult and nuanced topic, and I'm not doing a great job of explaining all of that here. But it talks a lot about how, for example, when people talk about kind of various kind of people of various different groups and their kind of needs, often Jewish people are left out of that conversation. And so, for example, it's kind of seen as an acceptable thing, you know, when for example, racism, anti-Semitism is called out. Sometimes people kind of say, well, actually, no, this is just an anti-Israeli thing. It's nothing to do with Jews, which is a bit of a complicated thing when you're talking about, you know, Israel, which is, you know, a largely Jewish state. Like that, you know, it's kind of difficult to unpin those to unpick those things. But yeah, kind of he talks a lot about that and how it's kind of quite complicated because, for example, people will say like, oh yeah, you're making too much of a fuss about this. And he's like, no, actually, when you say XYZ, this is incredibly anti-Semitic. Like there is, and that's not innocent. You know, there's a link from saying those things to active violence against Jewish people or people perceived as Jewish, and that has a massive effect on how we see kind of crime against people. So anti-Semitic attacks are seen as still, you know, seen obviously as abhorrent, but the conversation around them is quite different. So anyway, this book talks a lot about that. I urge you to check it out rather than my ramblings about it. But it was a really interesting introduction to that conversation for me. It's something that I'd wondered a bit with books that I've been reading about racism. It's kind of an area that I realized I knew very little about. So it's kind of always good to kind of try and educate yourself on some of these bits, and I think definitely using this as a really good first step to then going and reading a lot more about what anti-Semitism looks like and how it affects people and communities. Yeah, and then finally, Open Water by, again, I have not loaded up the name there, by Caleb Azumah Nelson. So this is a little novella. Again, I read this novella as part of the Hibernation with Simon Savage Reads, and I also read it with Simon as a buddy read, and so it's really interesting getting his thoughts on it as well. I think we both agreed that, you know, the prose, the kind of, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but the writing style of this is gorgeous. It's so poetic and rich and detailed, and it really has a strong sense of place. For me, a lot of it's focused around South London, and a lot of the areas that Nelson talks about in this book I know, so it's very weird. You know, he sort of mentioned Bellingham. I was like, okay, wait, okay, I know that area. He mentions a few other areas that I know fairly well, and it's really quite disconcerting to see that in books sometimes, but I think he has a really strong sense of place. A large part of the centre of this book is about this relationship between this man and this woman, and how they kind of articulate this relationship whilst kind of dealing with some of the traumas around them, not only sort of personal traumas from their kind of families or from their lives, but also the trauma that can come with being a black person in the UK, for example, or in Ireland in the case of the woman. Interestingly, neither of them, I think, have names throughout the book. It's kind of very much he, well, kind of I and she. And I say I, but the whole thing's written in second person, so you. And there's something really quite unsettling about the you in this book, the use of the second person in this book, because it kind of feels like someone relating back to a past self, and there's something so powerful and interesting about that in this book. So I thought this was really, really well done. I kind of wanted more of it. I think I felt like parts of it felt almost a bit unfinished to me. I mean, unfinished sounds harsh. Like, it's finished, but I kind of just wanted a bit more detail on some aspects of the story, because it did feel like some of them were quite quick time jumps. But I mean, it's about 150 pages long, so what was I really expecting? You know, I wasn't necessarily expecting Les Mis worth of story to be happening in that time. But I mean, I think it's a really gorgeous book. There are some absolutely stunning moments for me. I won't really go into them I can't really go into them without spoiling the book, but some really gorgeous moments that are just so beautifully written, and really capture sort of various sort of snapshots of this man's life in London. and I just really think it's worth checking out. Again, this is probably tired of me saying this. I think it's also going to be probably in contention for various prizes. Would not be surprised if this was a Booker long-listed novel. And yeah, I think it's really well worth checking out. So after all that, those are all of the books, the 28 books that I read this month. Phone died as I was saying that. So those are all the books that I have read over the month. It feels a bit weird to be talking about having various reading slumps during this month because obviously I've read 28 books, but many of those were audio, about half of them, and a lot of the physical books that I did read were the books that I read not as audio were very short. So apart from the children's book by A.S. Byatt, which is like 600 pages, most of the ones I read were quite short. But I mean, some really interesting books and some really great books that I absolutely adored. I'm really excited to talk a bit more about. But yes, I would love to hear your thoughts on any of these books. If you've read them, if they're things that you would be interested in reading, if you've read other things by the same authors or sort of similar books on similar topics. And also just, you know, if you've got any other thoughts, any good recommendations of books that you've read recently that you think I should check out. Anyway, I hope you are doing really well. I hope you are enjoying your reading, and take care. I've been Bob the Booker. Thank you very much. Bye bye. Take care. That was very enthusiastic. Take care. I'm Bob the Booker, slightly ill, but hanging in there. So take care and enjoy your reading. Bye bye.